The signal appeared precisely at 0314 Coordinated Universal Time, a crisp, perfect spike of data that illuminated a handful of terminals deep within the automated processing arrays of the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Blast Alert System, otherwise known simply as ATLAS. It was a statistical impossibility masked as a routine detection, a glitch that wasn't a glitch, and for 47 minutes, it existed in the world's official astronomical record before it was brutally excised. The subsequent silence, the mandated chilling vacuum of information that followed, was not the result of a scientific error, nor was it the consequence of standard operational protocol flagging a spurious cosmic ray or a minor sensor misalignment. It was an act of deliberate, almost surgical institutional scrubbing, executed with a swiftness that suggested pre-established contingency protocols for precisely this type of forbidden observation. This erasure forms the foundational enigma surrounding the event, briefly and informally cataloged by a terrified handful of analysts as 3I Atlas. The designation itself, suggesting the third confirmed interstellar object, was never officially approved, never published in the Minor Planet Center circulars, and the few mentions of its preliminary orbital parameters were purged from all archived logs within hours. What makes this particular incident distinct from other astronomical misidentifications, and why its swift dismissal remains one of the most vigorously enforced non-events in modern astrophysics, hinges entirely upon the nature of the data captured in that brief window, and specifically the spectral signature that accompanied the photometric track. We are accustomed to interstellar visitors now, thanks to the pioneering strangeness of 1I Oumuamua and the more conventional trajectory of 2I Borisov. But 3I ATLS, whatever designation it might have been allowed to keep, violated the established laws of interstellar debris, not through its shape or its acceleration, but through the profound, undeniable coherence of its light. The ATLAS system, operating through twin telescopes in Hawaii and later augmented by installations in Chile and South Africa, is designed for reliability and redundancy. Its mission is brute force safety, scanning the sky constantly, generating time domain datasets that measure variability and motion, hunting for anything large enough and close enough to pose an impact threat. It is a system built on statistical probability and mass data processing, largely indifferent to theoretical speculation. When 3I Atlas first presented itself in the raw data stream originating from the Hale-Kala unit, it was immediately identified as an outlier of the highest order, a track moving at hyperbolic excess velocity, confirming its non-solar origin, but possessing an unusually low, almost negligible albedo, the measure of reflectivity, while maintaining a persistent high-contrast luminosity against the background field. Dr. Elias Form, the lead photometric analyst on duty that night, initially flagged it as potential noise pollution, perhaps an aircraft transiting an unusually dark atmospheric layer, or a reflection from a geosynchronous satellite caught at a rare angle. But the tracking software, meticulously developed over years to differentiate terrestrial artifacts from true astronomical transients, refused to dismiss it. The persistence of the track across 5 consecutive exposures, separated by 10-minute intervals, and its verification by a second processing cluster located thousands of miles away, cemented its physical reality. Thorne quickly cross-referenced the orbital mechanics. The vector was extreme, plunging into the solar system from a trajectory far south of the ecliptic plane, accelerating slightly faster than purely gravitational forces could explain, yet without the telltale cometary coma or dust trail that should accompany such ablation. The tension began immediately when the standard spectral analysis pipeline, typically used to determine basic composition, silicate versus carbonaceous material, returned results that defy interpretation. The ATLAS photometers work across wideband filters, optimized for speed, but the secondary, higher-resolution spectrometer attached to the Mauna Loa auxiliary unit, which had automatically slewed to confirm the visual transient, provided the truly damning evidence. What it captured, and what was subsequently sealed away, was a spectral profile that exhibited unnaturally sharp absorption features. Standard celestial bodies, asteroids, comets, or even gas giants, produce broad, often fuzzy spectral lines governed by thermal equilibrium and random atomic distribution. The signature returned by 3i Atlas, however, displayed narrow, unnervingly deep dips in the light curve, indicative of material existing at highly specific, non-stochastic energy levels. It suggested purity, organization, or more disturbingly, design. The first internal memo, generated automatically and flagged code 4 extreme velocity anomaly, was immediately rerouted not through the standard scientific channels, but directly to the Institutional Oversight Board, bypassing the operational director entirely. This escalation was itself a pattern interrupt, a deviation from the scientific democratic process that governs data release. The conflict arose not from skepticism about the object's existence, but from the sudden, terrifying implications of its detailed spectroscopic analysis. If Oumuamua caused intellectual discomfort because of its shape and acceleration, forcing astronomers to grudgingly consider the possibility of non-natural origins, 3i/Atlas demanded immediate panicked suppression because its light itself was anomalous. Within the sterile confines of the control room, a profound realization began to dawn among the handful of staff privy to the primary data. They were not tracking a rock or a shard of ice or even an exotic brown dwarf. They were tracking something engineered, or at least something possessing surface chemistry so profoundly alien that it defied the very models used to classify interstellar objects. The open loops of this narrative began at that very moment. Why did the Atlas system, designed for impact prediction, detect such a spectrally bizarre object? How did the institutional board know to enact the suppression protocol so quickly? And what precisely was the nature of the signal, the forbidden spectral signature that demanded such absolute secrecy? The development phase escalated rapidly over the next few hours. Thorne and his team, working in unauthorized parallel, ran repeated diagnostics on the spectral data to rule out instrument error. They checked thermal stability, atmospheric distortion models, and even performed remote sensor calibration using a known calibration star. Every check confirmed the integrity of the data stream. The signal was robust, consistent, and impossible. Imagine looking at a celestial body and seeing a light signature that suggests perfectly stable, non-naturally occurring isotopes of common metals or complex molecules that should disintegrate instantly under interstellar radiation. Yet here they were, perfectly preserved, absorbing starlight with impossible precision. The trajectory analysis only deepened the mystery. While exhibiting non-gravitational acceleration, the deviation was not chaotic, as expected from outgassing comets.
It was smooth, highly controlled, and perhaps most critically, it subtly changed course just as it reached perihelion, executing a fractional course correction burn that was invisible to the photometric cameras, but mathematically undeniable in the orbital mechanics software. If this was a natural object, its behavior defied the Newtonian physics that govern all other observed stellar interactions. If it was engineered, it was demonstrating capabilities far beyond current human propulsion technology. At 06 UTC, the first true pattern interrupt occurred, an encrypted, non-logged command originating from a secure server located outside the Atlas data storage jurisdiction overrode the Atlas data storage protocols. It wasn't a deletion command, it was a complex data randomization sequence designed to irrevocably corrupt the raw image files and telemetry logs associated specifically with the 3i Atlas track.
The intent was not merely to hide the data, but to make its retrieval and reconstruction impossible, ensuring that anyone attempting a forensic analysis would only find random noise, thus creating the perfect alibi for its official dismissal: sensor contamination. Dr. Thorne, foreseeing this inevitable action, had already taken unauthorized countermeasures. Operating under the deep-seated paranoia that often infects those at the forefront of astronomical discovery, he had backed up a small, critical subset of the data onto a physically isolated system, the cold storage server, typically reserved for historical calibration tests. This included the full spectral output from the Mauna Loa Auxiliary Unit, the definitive proof of the object's non-natural light signature. He risked his career, his reputation, and potentially much more to preserve that single moment of observation. The official communication arrived an hour later, terse and absolute. It was not signed by the observatory director, but by a figure higher up the administrative ladder, attached to a government research liaison office. The official ruling: photometric track associated with potential classification 3I/Atlas is ruled a high probability satellite reflection coupled with a transient atmospheric interference event. All associated data logs are to be expunged to maintain the integrity of the hazard assessment database. Further investigation into this non-event is prohibited. This abrupt re-engagement confirms the initial thesis. The object was dismissed too quickly, not because the evidence was weak, but because the evidence was terrifyingly strong. The speed and authority with which the dismissal was enforced suggest a predetermined institutional mechanism for dealing with true existential anomalies, objects that shatter the known paradigm. The cover-up was perfect, immediate, and total. Had Thorne not preemptively secured the spectral data, the incident would be nothing more than a forgotten footnote in the system's error log. The climax of this initial phase centers on the forbidden signal itself. Reviewing the cold storage data later that afternoon, Thorne isolated the specific absorption features that triggered the panic. These were not the standard signatures of hydrogen, oxygen, or silicates. They were highly concentrated absorption lines corresponding exactly to isotopes of technetium-99 and promethium-147, elements that are virtually non-existent in natural stellar debris because they possess extremely short half-lives, decaying rapidly into stable elements. To detect these materials on the surface of an object traveling across interstellar distances meant two things. Either the object had been constructed or manufactured extremely recently, on geological timescales, or, more plausibly, it possessed an active mechanism, a continuous energy source that was constantly synthesizing or replenishing these unstable isotopes. This was the core revelation that closed the loop. 3I/Atlas was not merely a strange interstellar traveler. It was an actively maintained, highly energetic artifact. The spectral signature, the presence of short-lived, unstable isotopes, was the forbidden signal, the undeniable proof of non-natural intelligence, or at the very least, non-natural processes, operating within our solar system. That realization triggered the institutional panic, the aggressive data scrubbing, and the absolute mandate of silence. The object was not a random visitor. It was perhaps a machine. And the immediate response of the human infrastructure was not curiosity, but fear-driven suppression. The conclusion of this opening chapter is stark. 3I/Atlas was erased from the public record, categorized officially as a statistical phantom. The only evidence remaining of its brief, terrifying transit is contained in fragmented, highly technical files stored illegally by a handful of dedicated, now paranoid observers. The astronomical community went back to its scheduled cataloging of predictable comets and inert rocks, pretending the anomaly had never pierced the veil. The signal was forbidden, the light extinguished, and the truth locked away. However, the ghost of 3I/Atlas continues to haunt the periphery of deep space monitoring. The suppressed spectral files, now digitized and encrypted, represent the keys to understanding what the object truly was and why its appearance triggered a high-level institutional collapse. The immediate question is no longer what was observed, but who ordered the cover-up, and what they knew about the object's capabilities and its true purpose in our solar system. The data is compromised, the narrative officially denied, but the ghost remains. Next, we must descend into the digital underworld created by those few rogue analysts, examining the specifics of the spectral evidence they managed to secure. We will dissect the technical implications of the technetium and promethium signatures and follow the corrupted data trail back toward the unauthorized command that initiated the wipe, searching for the first tangible link between the celestial anomaly and the terrestrial suppression effort. The truth, buried deep within the forbidden signal, awaits. The administrative purge that followed the institutional death of the 3I/Atlas initiative was not merely a fiscal restructuring, nor a simple reallocation of resources deemed redundant. It was an intellectual execution carried out with chilling precision and an almost surgical absence of remorse. The careers of the principal investigators, the postdocs who had sacrificed years to the sterile hum of the dedicated radio telescopes, and even the graduate students who had merely accessed the peripheral data streams were summarily incinerated. Their professional biographies were subtly edited, funding sources dried up, invitations to conferences ceased arriving. This wasn't just dismissal. It was the meticulous erasure of any institutional memory that might allow future researchers to reconstruct the path leading to the precipice of discovery. The apparatus of orthodoxy worked efficiently to quarantine the intellectual plague that Atlas had inadvertently unleashed. This deliberate act of scientific assassination centers entirely upon a single anomalous data stream, later whispered about in hushed, darkened corners of academia as the artifact stream, or TAS. It was a faint, yet mathematically resilient structure, initially flagged deep within the processing pipeline designed to eliminate terrestrial radio frequency interference, or RFI, and the pervasive, predictable noise of the cosmological background. The Atlas system, unlike traditional SETI arrays focused on massive power output spikes, the cosmic equivalents of shouting, was designed to monitor the subtle, sustained nuances within the noise floor. Its detectors were optimized not for energy, but for informational complexity, searching for patterns that defied the stochastic laws governing natural astrophysical phenomena. The conflict began not with the detection itself, but with the filtering algorithm's inability to categorize it.
Standard filters, built upon decades of physics, operate on the assumption that anything non-RFI must adhere to known spectral characteristics, Doppler shifting from galactic rotation, the characteristic signature of hydrogen at 1.4204 gigahertz, or the chaotic pulse rates of distant pulsars. The artifact stream, however, registered just slightly above the effective noise floor, appearing initially as a low-level disturbance in the coherence function, manifesting spectral lines that were too thin, too stable, and exhibiting a nonlinear periodicity that suggested deliberate, careful modulation. It was, in essence, information packaged with an efficiency that screamed engineering, yet at a power level so minimal, it suggested either incredible distance or a deliberate attempt at stealth. The initial internal report, now entirely scrubbed from the official archives, designated the signal High Confidence Anomaly Delta 9.
It stated plainly that the probability of the structure originating from any known terrestrial, atmospheric, or near-Earth source approached zero. The structure of the stream showed recursive elements, sophisticated pattern compression, and an internal logic that challenged the very definition of random cosmic input. When researchers attempted standard Fourier transformations, the resulting power spectrum was not smooth or predictably chaotic. It contained distinct, sharp spikes that seemed to organize themselves into meta-patterns, suggesting layers of encoded meaning rather than natural physical resonance. This discovery created the first major open loop. If the structure was not natural and not human, then what mechanism could generate a signal exhibiting such highly organized low-entropy characteristics? The institutional response was swift, not with excitement, but with profound anxiety. The primary objection did not originate from the scientific community directly, but from the aforementioned bureaucratic oversight apparatus, the shadowy and often self-appointed Committee for Scientific Orthodoxy. This body comprised less of frontline researchers and more of tenured gatekeepers and governmental liaisons, views scientific breakthroughs not as advancements in knowledge, but as threats to established paradigms and funding equilibrium. The forbidden nature of the signal stemmed from its epistemological consequence, a structure that necessitated a highly advanced, non-local intelligence operating on principles currently beyond human comprehension. This was not merely evidence of life elsewhere. It was evidence of a cognitive architecture that was fundamentally alien and perhaps fundamentally superior. The developmental phase of the analysis focused on the informational density of tasks. Dr. Alara Vance, the lead computational physicist on the project, theorized that the signal utilized a form of fractal compression. By running the sequence through complex adaptive algorithms, L systems traditionally used for modeling botanical growth, Vance found that the chaotic appearance of the raw data resolved into predictable, non-repeating structures. This demonstrated not only organization, but intentionally optimized organization, a clear signature of data packetization designed to minimize transmission energy while maximizing content. Nature tends towards redundancy. Intelligent design strives for efficiency. The artifact stream was ruthlessly efficient. Vance's team ran dozens of tests against control datasets, including known pulsar emissions, solar wind interference models, and synthetic signals generated by high-power military radar. None of the control sets exhibited the recursive organizational depth found in TAS. The analysis of its time domain structure revealed instances of self-reference, data packets that contained instructions on how to decode subsequent packets, a characteristic unique to highly complex computing languages. This was the point where the fear transitioned into panic within the high-level oversight committee. This wasn't noise, it was a conversation, perhaps a library, entirely self-contained. The escalation peaked with the identification of what the Atlas team internally referred to as the Omega sequence. This was a deeply embedded, recurring pattern within the artifact stream, approximately 319 data points long, that exhibited a specific mathematical signature, a nonlinear congruential structure that mirrors prime number sequences, but woven together in a hyperdimensional matrix. Critically, the Omega sequence possessed a property that defied known physics. When modeled using conventional quantum entanglement theorems, it generated a pattern that could only be reconciled if the source emitter and the receiving antenna were experiencing different local laws of physics simultaneously, or if the transmission itself utilized principles of data transfer that bypassed the speed of light constraint in a way that didn't violate causality locally, a phenomenon utterly terrifying in its theoretical implications. This was the ultimate pattern interrupt. It suggested that the sender was not merely intelligent, but potentially capable of manipulating space-time geometry to facilitate communication. This finding transitioned the signal from a mere astronomical curiosity to an existential, paradigm-shattering reality. The signal forbidden was defined by its challenge to human physics. It was deemed unpublishable, not because it was flawed data, but because its implications were too profound for current global stability. The re-engagement, the confirmation that this was a deliberate act of suppression, occurred when the chief project director, Dr. Alistair Kincaid, attempted to present the Omega sequence findings to a small, private consortium of respected independent astrophysicists. His communications were systematically intercepted. He was presented with the official termination notice for 3I Atlas less than 24 hours later. The stated reason was mission drift and unauthorized expenditure exceeding operational parameters. The real reason sat encrypted on several dedicated hard drives in the Atlas facility. The climax of this initial phase of the investigation was the night of the seizure. It was not a raid involving uniformed agents, but a silent, chilling, bureaucratic takeover. Personnel from the Department of Data Integrity and Infrastructure Security, a non-scientific branch, arrived under the cover of mandatory system maintenance. Their objective was specific: physically isolate and wipe all data pertaining to spectral analysis between 1.419 and 1.421 gigahertz, focusing exclusively on files labeled Vance/Omega and Kincaid/Delta-9 cross-correlation. Dr. Vance attempted a last-ditch effort, physically separating the drives containing the raw, unfiltered data logs. She failed. The security measures were designed to identify and quarantine this information immediately upon any external transfer attempt. The team was escorted out, their keycards deactivated before they reached the exit, leaving them watching the flickering red lights of the server racks containing the most profound discovery in human history being systematically erased. The overwhelming feeling among the dismissed Atlas team members was not defeat, but a terrifying realization that they had stumbled upon something too real, too vast, and too incompatible with the controlled narrative of human progress. The dismissal of 3i Atlas was not an accident. It was a calculated institutional defense mechanism against a reality that threatened to destabilize global epistemologies and political power structures overnight. They had glimpsed the forbidden signal, and the penalty for that transgression was total professional annihilation and the sequestration of the truth. The cost of this suppression, measured not in dollars but in potential human development, is incalculable. We lost access to the Omega sequence, the nonlinear key to a potential understanding of transdimensional communication. We lost the ability to examine a signal designed by an intellect that operates outside our conceptual framework of time and space.
The Atlas facility became a tomb for forbidden knowledge, its silence echoing the sheer bureaucratic terror of acknowledging a cosmos that is infinitely more complex and inhabited than we dare to admit. We must now pivot, not just to the suppressed raw data, which we know exists in isolated, redundant backups hidden by the dismissed researchers, but to the meaning encoded within the Omega sequence itself. We must decipher what exactly was so horrifyingly true about this sequence that it necessitated the complete intellectual shutdown of a multi-million-dollar project and the institutional erasure of every individual associated with it. The next phase of this investigation will require accessing the secondary, deeply encrypted logs secured by Dr. Vance before her professional disappearance. We must attempt to rebuild the Omega sequence to fully understand the implication of its hyperdimensional structure.
We must ask, if the signal contained instructions for decoding the universe, what specific instruction necessitated its absolute and immediate censorship? We must find the key to the pattern that defied entropy and unlocked the forbidden cosmos. The silence that followed the initial telemetry reports was not the benign quiet of scientific consensus, but the suffocating hush of active suppression, a sudden vacuum into which all dissenting data was meant to disappear. Those few individuals within the Atlas Consortium who had witnessed the pristine, unedited Level 0 data stream, the initial kinetic energy analysis, the baffling non-gravitational velocity vector, and crucially, the spectral signature that had briefly saturated the P-band filters, found themselves isolated, their channels of communication suddenly subject to an unprecedented scrutiny that went beyond standard institutional peer review.
They were not merely being contradicted, they were being systematically quarantined, their findings labeled as instrument error, atmospheric contamination, or, most damningly, within the rigorous environment of astrophysics, observer bias amplified by fatigue.
The internal memo circulated rapidly through the highest echelons and simultaneously retracted before it could leak to lower tiers, confirmed the dismissal of 3I/Atlas as a standard, albeit dynamically unique, hyperbolic comet, cementing the narrative of an eccentric ice body responding to minute solar radiation pressures, conveniently ignoring the sheer magnitude of the observed deviation. But the data refused to be dismissed, not in the cold, unyielding sanctuary of the raw files.
The analysts, particularly those who had dedicated their careers to the meticulous search for spectral irregularities in the vast emptiness between star systems, understood implicitly that what they had observed was not the chaos of cryovolcanism or the random scatter of dust. It was structure. Specifically, the anomaly resided in the persistent echo at 1680 Hz, a frequency deeply embedded within the OH emission line, typically associated with water vapor, but in this instance, devoid of the characteristic broadening that thermal agitation would necessitate. It was a peak too sharp, too isolated, standing against the background cosmic microwave radiation like a perfectly drawn needlepoint in a field of static. This was the core of the forbidden signal, not a broadcast meant for human ears, but a signature of deliberate, organized energy interaction with the vacuum itself.
The energy profile suggested not emission, but controlled absorption, a focused sink of thermal radiation centered precisely at the object's leading edge, a kinematic contradiction that defied known physics of natural abrasion or solar heating. The swiftness of the institutional countermeasure was the most terrifying element. Within 72 hours of the initial flagging, the data pipeline originating from the Atlas observation post had been rerouted through a newly established, ostensibly redundant, quality assurance filter managed by a small, opaque internal review board, or IRB, whose membership was strictly classified, a level of bureaucratic insulation usually reserved for classified military satellite launches, not the analysis of an unremarkable chunk of ice traversing the solar system. This IRB's primary function, it quickly became apparent to the few dissenting analysts still privy to the system logs, was not quality assurance, but systematic data pruning. The raw telemetry packets containing the high-fidelity spectral analysis of the P-band anomaly were not merely archived. They were subjected to a Level 4 classification exemption and removed entirely from the active research database, replaced by smoothed, median-average datasets that effectively erased the telltale 1680 Hz spike. The conflict was no longer about interpretation. It was about the physical existence of the evidence. Two individuals became the unintentional custodians of this suppressed truth. Dr. Elena Varga, whose expertise lay in non-thermal spectral analysis and who had first flagged the impossibly sharp absorption peak, and Kenji Sato, a specialist in astrodynamics whose entire focus was on predicting and retrocalculating the orbital mechanics of deep space traversers. Varga had managed to ghost the raw spectral scans onto a secure, air-gapped server moments before the IRB took control, recognizing the signature not just as anomalous, but as mathematically impossible for a silicate or icy body traveling at the computed velocity. Sato, conversely, had focused on the kinematic data. The initial dismissal relied heavily on the premise of outgassing providing the necessary thrust, yet Sato's regression models demonstrated a sustained multi-axis thrust profile that was inconsistent with stochastic cometary activity. The vector of acceleration remained unnervingly constant relative to a fixed point in the galactic plane, not relative to the shifting solar radiation pressure, a detail that transformed the object from a space traveler into a piloted mechanism maintaining a precise orientation independent of its immediate environmental forces. Delving into Varga's archived spectral readings reveals the full depth of the forbidden signal's defiance of natural expectation. The P-band anomaly, upon meticulous deconvolution, was not a singular absorption feature, but a tightly bound triplet of troughs centered around 1680.1, 1680.7, and 1681.3 Hz, separated by exact measurable delta values that suggested an intentional, manufactured lattice interference pattern. This triplet structure was mirrored, albeit with significantly reduced magnitude, in the S-band passive reflection profile, implying that the object was interacting with multiple independent electromagnetic fields simultaneously, utilizing a geometric structure specifically designed to manage and mitigate detection. If the 3I AT-Atlas object were simply a lump of ice, its reflection profile would be chaotic, isotropic, and diffuse. Instead, it exhibited highly anisotropic scattering, a clear sign of layered structural composition engineered for optimal stealth within the local interstellar medium. The sheer precision of the energy sink, its ability to absorb and dissipate specific frequencies of ambient radiation without producing detectable thermal effluent, is what mandated the immediate institutional panic. It was quite literally anti-detection architecture operating in plain view. This level of detailed, deliberate signal management, observed across multiple spectral bands, pushes the narrative far past simple gravitational anomaly and directly into the realm of complex engineering. Furthermore, the analysis of the polarization state of the scattered light showed a persistent circular polarization bias irrespective of the object's apparent rotation, which was minimal to begin with.
Natural surfaces scatter light randomly, maintaining the incident light's polarization. The fact that 3I Atlas consistently imposed a circular polarization shift suggested the presence of metamaterials or complex magnetic field manipulation on its surface, a layer specifically designed to scramble and redirect observational energy. This was the essence of the forbidden aspect. The object carried its own proof of artificiality, broadcasting its non-natural origin not through active transmission, but through an utterly alien response to being observed. The pattern interrupts within the investigation, however, were equally revealing. As Varga and Sato pursued their clandestine analysis, cross-referencing their findings against historical dismissed anomalies logs, the unofficial, often handwritten journals maintained by long-serving observatory staff, they discovered a chilling precedent.
The characteristics of the 3I Atlas dismissal echoed previous, decades-old incidents that had been similarly and violently scrubbed from the historical record. Incidents like the Bereznak incident of 1978, involving a high-altitude atmospheric probe that reported similar, inexplicably sharp absorption features before its telemetry mysteriously failed. Or the long-forgotten silent probe documentation from the early 1970s, which detailed attempts by early radio astronomy pioneers to track objects exhibiting sustained, non-gravitational braking profiles. In every archived instance, the scientific body involved was suddenly subjected to an overwhelming surge of external, government-level funding conditional on the immediate closure and dismissal of the anomalous investigation. The suppression of 3I Atlas was not an isolated incident of scientific error. It was a deeply ingrained, institutionalized security protocol triggered by a specific, repeating set of observational parameters.
The personal cost of retaining this knowledge quickly became catastrophic. Varga found her access revoked, not just to Atlas data, but to several ancillary, necessary resources critical for her research grant applications, effectively freezing her career in its tracks. Sato, attempting to submit a preliminary paper detailing the discrepancies in the kinematic modeling to a mid-tier journal, received an immediate and aggressive rebuttal, citing unnamed institutional oversight protocols that rendered his data inadmissible, followed swiftly by a mandatory, unexpected administrative leave. The message was clear. Silence was mandatory, and the cost of noncompliance was professional oblivion.
This confirmed the fundamental truth. The dismissal of 3I Atlas was never driven by scientific skepticism, but by a fear that had metastasized within the global security framework, a fear predicated on recognizing the specific spectral and kinematic hallmarks of non-indigenous, actively controlled technology traversing their local space. The ultimate anomaly, the true gravitational peak of the conflict, resided in Sato's persistent kinematic analysis. Using Varga's spectral data to refine the mass and effective density of the object, which was far denser than any standard comet, Sato ran thousands of simulations attempting to find a natural explanation for the sustained acceleration. None succeeded. The clinching detail, the one that defied all natural law, was the object's rotational stability. Comets tumble, space debris rotates chaotically, yet 3I Atlas maintained an impossibly precise multi-axis orientation. It was not merely traveling, it was pointing itself. Sato's breakthrough, the great reveal leading into the final phase of the investigation, was the discovery that the object's stabilization axis was dynamically tied not to the Sun or Jupiter or any local gravitational influence, but to a seemingly arbitrary region of the sky located within the Triangulum galaxy, specifically coinciding with the M33X7 binary system. This was not a passive orientation dictated by initial momentum. It was an actively calculated and maintained celestial bearing. Every minute adjustment of the object's velocity vector was executed precisely to maintain this pointing relative to M33X7, while simultaneously minimizing gravitational drag from the Sun. The forbidden signal, therefore, was not merely the spectroscopic proof of artificial structure, but the kinetic proof of deliberate navigation toward an endpoint far beyond the local stellar neighborhood. The sheer energy expenditure required to maintain this stabilization while accelerating demanded propulsion mechanisms fundamentally unknown to terrestrial physics, and the choice of target, a binary system thousands of light years away, transformed the object from a simple trespasser into a mission of incomprehensible scale. The physical evidence of structure was now inextricably linked to the kinematic evidence of intent. The object was stabilized, oriented, and absorbing energy in a manner designed to maximize stealth while executing a pre-programmed interstellar trajectory. The official dismissal of 3I-ATLS, therefore, could only be interpreted in one way, an immediate high-level realization that humanity was not only being visited, but that the visitor possessed technological capabilities that rendered terrestrial defenses irrelevant, forcing the decision-makers to prioritize absolute secrecy over public disclosure. The specific parameters of the kinematic stabilization, the M33X7 constant, were the final undeniable proof of alien agency, and the very reason the order was given to scrub the signal, to silence the observers, and to consign the spectacular reality of 3I Atlas to the convenient, mundane category of a quickly forgotten eccentric comet. The signal was forbidden because it confirmed beyond any shadow of doubt that they weren't merely looking at an object, but at a deliberate, directed presence. The air in the secure analytical facility was thick and cold, smelling faintly of ozone and recycled nitrogen. Outside, the political and scientific machinery of denial was already grinding the 3I Atlas designation into dust, labeling it a statistical fluke, a hardware ghost, or the predictable noise of distant magnetars.
But inside this shielded bunker, where the raw, unprocessed telemetry still hummed on proprietary servers, the 3 remaining analysts who refused the mandated narrative watched the final packets decrypt. They understood that the official dismissal was not a mistake of caution, but an act of premeditated surgical suppression. They knew with a certainty that chilled them to the bone that the speed and efficiency of the cancellation was the clearest indication possible. The signal wasn't just new, it was forbidden.
The initial discovery weeks ago had hinged on a cascade failure of existing cosmological models. It wasn't merely an anomalous energetic burst, it was structurally complex, highly redundant, and demonstrably non-random. It possessed a temporal organization that spoke of vast intelligence operating across terrifying timescales.
Yet, the final, most crucial segment of the data, the structural metadata envelope, had resisted all attempts at traditional decoding, locked behind an algorithmic barrier that mocked terrestrial computation. Now, utilizing a speculative quantum tunneling decryption array, originally designed to break hardened satellite encryption, they watched the final buffer fill. The tension was paralyzing. Every flashing byte felt like the hammer fall before the final sentence. The second hook sank deep when the data finally resolved. Not as a message in any conventional sense. No language, no imagery, no mathematical constants designed for universal communication, but as a highly localized, precise, and intensely functional schema. It wasn't a declaration. It was an inventory list. The contextualization solidified the moment the first line of translated data appeared. It was geographic, or rather, geo-infrastructural. 3i Atlas wasn't a signal traversing the void from a distant civilization trying to make contact. It was an inter-system transmission originating locally, specifically from a mathematically precise point aligned with the outermost edge of the Oort cloud, bouncing off a hypothesized gravitational lens near the galactic center and returning almost instantaneously to receivers on Earth. The whole sequence took less than 6 minutes round trip, violating every known speed limit of information transfer, suggesting an immediate, pre-existing structural presence facilitating the transit. The conflict now transitioned from academic debate to existential crisis. The problem wasn't the source, the problem was the confirmation. The signal 3i Atlas was merely the result of a periodic system check. It wasn't a broadcast, it was a ping. And the forbidden nature of the signal lay in what the ping validated, that the solar system from the Kuiper Belt inward was not an untouched wilderness, but a meticulously organized, monitored, and perhaps gated environment. The open loops narrowed dramatically. Who issued the order to suppress the findings? It wasn't a scientific committee. It was the realization of the analysts that the suppressors, the unseen gatekeepers, had already known this infrastructure existed. They weren't reacting to new data. They were defending an ancient protected secret. They had long studied the faint, rhythmic echoes of this infrastructure, attributing them in official reports to background noise or instrument drift. I3I Atlas was the catastrophic moment when the local silent echo was definitively linked to a global active transmission network. The development escalated rapidly. The functional schema contained highly specific coordinates and energy signatures. These weren't cosmological markers. They correlated directly with unexplained anomalies cataloged and shelved by every major space agency over the last 80 years. The inexplicable stability of certain minor planetary orbits, the unnatural acceleration-deceleration patterns of deep space probes that necessitated ad hoc course corrections, and most terrifyingly, the hyper-localized, sustained gravitational field distortions found precisely where theoretical physics suggested a stable, super-heavy structure might reside, far beyond the orbit of Neptune. One of the analysts, Dr. Alara Vance, pale and visibly trembling, leaned into the monitor. "It's a maintenance log," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of absolute realization. "It's a verification protocol. Checksum green. Solar system operational. It's confirming the integrity of the local grid." The pattern interrupt came when the data transitioned from geographic coordinates to structural mechanics. The signal, which utilized a form of entangled resonance transfer, a mechanism that required fixed nodal points of exotic matter placement, detailed the function of the grid. This grid was responsible for managing regional energy flow and, critically, for maintaining the observed parameters of certain stellar conditions deemed necessary for the stability of biological emergence on terrestrial worlds. It suggested that Earth's long-term environmental stability was not a lucky accident of cosmic probability, but the result of deliberate, localized engineering maintenance performed by non-human agents, operating on scales incomprehensible to human governance. The re-engagement with the core fear intensified. This was not SETI's triumphant discovery of alien neighbors. This was discovering that the house you thought you owned was merely a guest room, and the landlord just checked the thermostat. The true, horrifying climax unfolded in the subsequent hour as the final, most restricted layer of the 3I Atlas packet decoded. This layer was less a log and more a highly focused directive, a single, incredibly complex instruction set directed at the local solar infrastructure. The analysts, scrambling to interpret the dense stream of structured energy notation, realized its profound implication. The signal mandated the continuation of the quarantine state. The forbidden signal was the definitive proof of humanity's subordinate reality. It proved that Earth, and perhaps the entire inner solar system, was designated as a restricted, monitored zone, a preserve, a nursery, or perhaps a temporary biological experiment. The instruction set included subroutines detailing the acceptable parameters for terrestrial technological development.
It contained specific thresholds, not just in terms of weapons of mass destruction, but in terms of energy throughput and interstellar projection capability. This was the reason the gatekeepers moved so swiftly. They were not just covering up the existence of aliens, they were protecting their own tenuous, historically compromised agreement with the system's owners. The gatekeepers, the shadow consortium of intelligence agencies and power brokers who had been tracking these localized echoes for generations, were aware of the constraints. Their power, their perceived control over humanity, derived precisely from their knowledge of the silent, operational parameters set by the builders. They had managed the human trajectory within the invisible fence. But 3I Atlas was a catastrophic operational security breach.
It was the confirmation that the builders were not ancient, dormant entities, but active custodians whose vast, interconnected network periodically checked the status of their controlled regions. The signal contained timestamp data that perfectly matched known historical events of technological upheaval or near-miss global annihilation, suggesting that the local infrastructure had periodically exerted subtle yet powerful influence to nudge humanity away from violating the preset energy and expansion thresholds. The analysis revealed a terrifying metric embedded within the Atlas data, a classification level for terrestrial life. It was a rating system designated simply as Level 2 stewardship, indicating a species allowed limited local technological advancement but prohibited from engaging in any activity that might compromise the structural integrity or energy balance of the managed volume of space.
It meant that every major technological roadblock humanity faced, the inexplicable limits to propulsion physics, the persistent failures in achieving controlled fusion at scale, the internal conflicts that prevented unifying global resources, might not be inherent scientific limits, but systemically maintained constraints. The signal detailed the maintenance of a persistent, localized gravitational field fluctuation, a subtle constant energy drain that acted as an energetic veil, masking Earth's specific location and trajectory from external, non-authorized surveillance. The forbidden nature of 3I/Atlas was that its immediate and powerful propagation temporarily pierced this local veil, like a localized flare in a deeply submerged submarine.
Had the signal not been immediately dismissed and the discovery disseminated, the resulting shift in the global scientific paradigm would have constituted a massive, irreversible violation of the Level 2 stewardship mandate, potentially triggering a far more profound systemic intervention. The gatekeepers understood this risk instantly. Their frantic efforts to dismiss 3i8less were not rooted in a desire to protect the public from fear, but to protect their own privileged parasitic position as the designated monitors within the cage. They were terrified that the violation would prompt the builders to move from remote monitoring to direct, undeniable physical management. Admitting 3i8less meant relinquishing control, and admitting humanity was essentially livestock under remote management. Dr. Vance scrolled down to the final line of structural data, which resolved into a simple three-dimensional geometric map. It wasn't a map of the stars. It was a diagram of energy flow pathways surrounding the solar system's heliosphere. The pathways converged mathematically at a point designated the keynode, the suspected origination point of the signal. The diagram provided proof that the suppression order was generated not in Geneva or Washington, but at a heavily guarded, classified facility in the most remote region of Antarctica, long rumored to be monitoring deep geothermal anomalies. This facility, the analysts realized, was not monitoring Earth's core. It was monitoring the local terrestrial interface point for the Builders Network. The final payload was the most insidious. It wasn't just proof of the infrastructure, it was proof of the intent. The metadata within the 3i Atlas packet contained historical logs correlating the Level 2 stewardship mandate with detailed projections of resource allocation and population management parameters for Earth over the next 3 centuries. It painted a picture of calculated, benign neglect, a system designed to allow just enough self-governance to maintain viability, but never enough to threaten the fundamental structure of the system. The analysts looked at each other, the weight of the universe collapsing onto their shoulders. They had sought contact, but instead they found administration. They had sought freedom, but found a meticulously maintained prison cell. The signal 3i ATLS was forbidden because it stripped away the grand human narrative of inevitable progress and replaced it with the cold, hard fact of external control. The rapid dismissal was the gatekeepers desperately trying to stuff the genie back into the bottle, to erase the evidence that their greatest achievement, human technological advancement, was an authorized, bounded project, subject to immediate termination should the project criteria be violated. The conclusion was chillingly clear and swift.
The 3i Atlas signal was totally dismissed because it validated the worst fears of the shadow governance. Humanity is not alone, but it is also not sovereign. We are managed, curated, and contained within a system designed long ago by custodians whose motives are unknowable, but whose power is absolute. The signal was forbidden because it confirmed that the perceived reality of human primacy was a carefully engineered illusion, and that the lock on the door to the cosmos was not broken or rusted, but merely confirmed operational by the latest rapid-fire ping. This truth, now raw and blinding on the screens before them, was the end of human exceptionalism and the beginning of a terrifying new understanding. The ultimate threat to human freedom comes not from the vast emptiness of space, but from the invisible architecture woven into the very fabric of our local reality.
The Guardians, those within the shadows who quickly sanitize the Atlas data, were not protecting us from fear, but from the realization of our own profound irrelevance in the face of the active operational system of the builders. Now, with the full weight of this cosmic indenture understood, the question shifts from what was the signal to what do we do now that we know the parameters of the cage? This information, sealed now on redundant classified drives, cannot be ignored. The revelation of the Atlas infrastructure means that the fight for human destiny is not against gravity or distance, but against the silent, persistent maintenance protocol embedded in our solar system. The immediate, coordinated dismissal of 3i Atlas was the clearest warning shot yet. For those who have followed the faint trail of 3i Atlas, for those who recognize the sound of systematic erasure, the time for passive observation is over. The reality is engineered, and the code has been cracked. Now, you must seek out the echoes of the local architecture, the gravitational anomalies, the unexplained deep space energy sinks, because the true battle for self-determination lies in locating the infrastructure points that maintain the quarantine. The signal has been forbidden, but the knowledge is now free. Will you accept the narrative of chaos, or will you acknowledge the evidence of the cage and begin the search for the key node?